Chapter 4. Alicia didn't see the club until she was right at it. Her mood deflated, and she started to hyperventilate, cursing herself for getting lost on the way to the temp agency. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't see. All she could manage to do was pull to a section of metered parking right in front of her personal hell. The club was the reason that she did not come downtown. When she was still pregnant, she had gotten lost looking for an apartment she was supposed to tour. She drove down this same street. The panic gripped her, and she slammed on her brakes, causing another car to rear-end her. Alicia couldn't breathe, and she couldn't think. When she finally began to have control over the panic, she was in an emergency room. Thankfully, her baby was fine, but it was over a year before she drove again. She never went back downtown. Alicia took another deep breath. She was better now. She could handle this. If only she had followed the damn directions. The club was tucked in between a clothing boutique and a pay parking lot. It looked so much smaller than she remembered it. It was just a bunch of siding that seemed added on to the rest of the center. She could not imagine how something so lifeless could have taken away so much of herself. She should never have gone to the club that night. In the past, she had always said no when her roommates tried to drag her out of the house. They begged and pleaded to try to allure her with how much fun she would have. All they wanted was a designated driver allowing them to party together. Their idea of fun was so different from Alicia's. She enjoyed the quiet of the house while they were out. She could curl up in the living area with a book without worrying about being disturbed. The club was loud and bright. You had to stand shoulder to shoulder with other people. She usually spent the hour they took to get ready rebuking their attempts to get her to join. Except she had just had her last final. Her third year of college was finished, and she would be coming back a senior. 2 of her roommates were graduating, and one was taking a year off to visit Europe. She had no illusion that they would keep in touch with her, and she wanted one memory where she felt like she belonged. So she decided that she would go. They got all dressed up in makeup and skirts, 2 things Alicia typically avoided at all costs. Her face itched from the caked-on makeup. The clothes were too tight. The black miniskirt, borrowed from one roommate, was combined with a nearly see-through top borrowed from another. Alicia had second thoughts just looking in the mirror. Trying to drive without a skirt riding up didn't help. It didn't take long before her roommates left her for the dance floor. Now she sat abandoned at the table with half-empty glasses as company. There was no personal space in the club. Even sitting, she was constantly being touched as people walked by. Others leaned against her as they talked or even danced. People sat down at the tiny table without even asking, taking advantage of the one free chair. They would laugh, talk, and even make out before getting up and moving on. Strangers were everywhere, but her roommates were gone. She hadn't seen any of them in at least half an hour. She saw the flash of green when he sat down. Alicia lifted her head from her drink to the dance floor, pretending to be looking for someone who had just slipped off to pick up a new drink or use the restroom. If people thought she was with someone, then they would hopefully leave her alone. It seemed to work. No one had so much as glanced in her direction in a while. The new arrival, though, was staring at her. It made her skin prickle. Alicia glanced up briefly and saw him looking straight at her. She looked away again and fixed her gaze onto the dance floor. The brief contact hadn't allowed her to see much. He was wearing a green suit that stood out against the dark clothing of the rest of the club. His lips were lifted in a sneer, making Alicia feel almost like prey. She wanted to move, but she had no idea where to go. She stood up and peered into the darkened club, searching for even one face that she recognized. There was no one. She had to choose if she was going to run or stand her ground. Alicia sat back down and turned toward the man. She opened up her stance, appearing larger than she was. Then turned and met the man's gaze. She didn't look him directly in the eyes. She only did so when it was absolutely necessary. To look a complete stranger in the eyes was barbaric. Instead, she gazed at his nose and lips, just close enough to be acceptable. The man's skin almost seemed to glow under the club lights. It was a flushed combination of green and purple that made her a bit ill to keep looking at, but she did. The man's lips were thin and never moved from a sneer that seemed to show that he was better than everyone else around him. The most overconfident people were also the most insecure. Most men just had to be shown you were not easy prey, And then you had to give them an out that didn't make them lose face among their fellow males. At least, that is what her books on body language had told her. Except the man didn't back down after the first few seconds. He kept staring, and, if anything, looked even more amused. He seemed to be a few years older than her, probably in his late 20s or early 30s. His suit grew uglier the more she looked at it. It was bright green on the surface, but it was traced through with darker green in a lace-like pattern. His hands were placed on the table, gently clasped like he was waiting patiently. The man's face was on the ugly side, with his weird skin and thin lips. His hair was an inconsequential brown that didn't seem to lay flat. She caught a brief glimpse of his eyes and nearly gasped. They were light brown, minor enough. However, they seemed filled with assurance, like he had nothing to worry about because the entire world belonged to him. He never stopped looking. He just sat relaxed, in no hurry, and gave no signs that he planned to ever get up and walk away. Alicia knew it was too late to leave now, but she was too afraid to move away from him also. She felt her heart beating fast, and her breath started to catch. She had to keep control, so she began to count in her head. It had always calmed her. 1, 2, 3. She reached 253 before he finally spoke. "Want to dance?" he asked. "No, thank you. I'm saving the table for my friends." "It seems they left you here while they get to have all the fun. That isn't fair at all. Come dance with me." Her hands were clutched tight around her untouched soda, but he grabbed at her left wrist and began to tug her towards the dance floor. "No!" she screamed. She pulled back on her wrist, holding on to the table with her other hand. But he was stronger than her and determined to pull her away. Alicia felt someone brush against her back. "Help me," she said. She looked up to see a face so pale it nearly glowed in the club lights. She jerked away towards the man in the green suit, who used the opportunity to pull her further away from the table. "Let me go," Alicia demanded, but the man just laughed and tightened his grip. "Excuse me, sir." Alicia looked back at the pale man. He stood rigidly with his hands straight at his side. His hair was nearly as pale as his skin, but his eyes were a bright blue. "Perhaps it would be best if we found you another dance partner," the man said. The smile dropped away from the man in green, and his face darkened. "How dare you question me? Are you loyal or not?" "Yes, sir. You know that I am." "Then stay out of my way." The man in green caught both of Alicia's wrists and wrapped them around her. He began to drag her again, this time towards the bar rather than the dance floor. She screamed and kicked, and when that did not work, she bent her legs and dropped to the floor. But the man in green just lifted her like she weighed nothing. Everyone went on like they could not see what was happening. Everyone except the blue-eyed man. She looked at him, forcing herself to make eye contact, and pleaded for him to help her. He looked back. His face seemed indifferent to what was happening before him. "Help me," she pleaded again. He moved slightly, and Alicia felt a brief glimmer of hope. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled back, returning to his stoic stance. She fought as she was pulled out to the side of the club. She remembered that it was dark, and there seemed to be no one around. The moon was bright in the sky, giving just enough light to see the garbage lying on the ground. When the man in green tried to kiss her, she bit him, drawing blood. She remembered him hitting her, but she must have blacked out. She had no other memory until she woke up the next morning, still at the side of the building. Her clothes were torn, and her body hurt everywhere. When Alicia tried to stand, her ankle protested under the weight. She propped herself up against the building and leaned on it until she walked out to the street. It was empty this early in the morning, but she could see traffic a few streets ahead. She walked slowly, leaning on what she could until someone noticed her and called for an ambulance. She spent a night at the hospital being lectured by grown men about drinking in excess, even though she had no alcohol in her blood. 1 month later, she found out that she was pregnant.